Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Hype, Practical and Responsible Use Cases for Agentic AI. I am happy to introduce our speakers and agenda today. Really quick, let's run through what we'll be doing. I'll do some quick introductions, then we'll get a discussion between our speakers, and we'll dive right into submitted questions. Some are pre-submitted, some will be submitted live. There's a Q&A function that we encourage you to use. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers. First, we have Kelsey Hightower, former Distinguished Engineer, Google Cloud, author, OSS contributor, and technical advisor. Next, we have FusionAuth Stan Moore, Senior Director of SIAM Strategy and Industry Standards at FusionAuth. Today, we'll be discussing Agentic AI, Auth, and all submitted questions. Again, you can ask questions the whole time, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function. That being said, Dan, I'm going to hand it to you to kick off the discussion with Kelsey.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And Ben, I got to call you out a little bit. We're not going to get to all the questions. I would love if we got to all the questions. We probably won't, but there's so many interesting things to talk about. But I wanted to kind of set the stage, and we'll talk for 5 or 10 minutes about Agentic Auth and some use cases, and then we'll move right to those questions as Ben mentioned. So the first question I had for you, Kelsey, is in March 2025, you had a nice blue sky post that talked about, I'm going to quote, most of what we call tech is about getting the right information into a database and trying to prevent the wrong person from reading or updating that database. And so when you think about agentic AI systems, is it really a new problem, or is it just kind of an old problem in a trench coat?
Yeah, I think the fundamentals are the same. So I think that particular post gets at the fundamentals of computing. A lot of people probably skipped all of that, right? Just got into industry. Maybe you learned a web framework. Maybe you went to a code school. Nothing wrong with those options, by the way. But I think most people just dove into existing frameworks and they skipped all the fundamentals, which is most computing is meant to manage data. No data, no computing required. And I think a lot of people have gotten confused by that. So the next thing I think AI agents, this today specifically, this concept of automation, like if you've ever tried to automate anything, it becomes much easier when there's good documentation, libraries, and APIs. If you had those things, you can literally write a bash script, use curl, and a lot of this stuff will be super easy. But I remember like at the dawn of the web when people had like most information was hidden behind a web page, no API, you may have to log in first. And in many ways, the HTML, the CSS, the style sheet, the whole layout of the page became this pseudo API, super rigid, could change any day. And at that point, most people started to do things like screen scrape. A lot of this agentic AI stuff reminds me of that world. We have a lot of surfaces, we have a lot of information trapped in these systems with no clean APIs, but the fundamentals are roughly the same. Your goal is to try to get some tasks, some set of steps completed. And I think the reason why people are super excited right now is not like I'm thinking that it doesn't deserve some attention. It's that most of the things we're interacting with that are useful, they don't have APIs. And so this agentic world gives us a new framework for trying to automate things that we thought were previously either too hard or impossible or locked behind the black box.
So when you say we really just all want clean APIs, is the solution for us, or are there incentives for people who want to get on the AI train or want to like get some of the benefits of this? Are there incentives for those libraries, APIs, and docs different than the incentives were in 2020 before the kind of dawn of the agentic AI world?
I think so. I mean, I think some of the incentives right now is that it's cool to have a MCP server, right? This model context protocol that says, hey, if you want an AI agent, artificial intelligence, to be able to do anything without a human in the loop, then you're going to have really, really good APIs. Bonus step if you have some additional tooling to make this work. So I think 10 years ago, they're like, no, you can do it. You can log in, you can click around, you're the API, you're the agent. And so we just had people doing all of these manual tasks. There was an incentive then to give people like me and a lot of people probably watching this particular talk an API so we could automate these tasks, right? Let's just talk about a task that is hard to automate. A customer emails you a purchase order. It can come in any format. It could be the tool of their choice that has a purchase number, someone hidden in that invoice, and then you have to extract that particular purchase order. There is no standard for how people will send you an invoice or some contract to do business. So in those cases, since there's no clean API, maybe you can consider SMTP, the email, as an API, but once you get the artifact, the actual document, good luck parsing that. And so you could try to make a hard-coded parser, but then it wouldn't be flexible enough. So I understand why people want to use tools like OCI or OCRs, or maybe even a AI agent that can actually parse these things using classical ML techniques. But the problem is, since you don't have an API, usually we just left those tasks to be manual. But if you were to have an API, let's say there was a universal standard called invoice, and there was an invoice library, then what you could do is like receive an invoice, you don't care where it came from. You would just call the invoice library and extract the purchase order. Downstream would be easy. There was an incentive then. Now I think given the AI hype, if we're going to make this thing work, then now we're going to really have to have APIs, because to rely on irreliable screen scraping and that just burns a bunch of tokens. So the last thing I'll say here is that I don't think there's a great incentive to say it this way. I think there's an incentive to have people burning tokens to pretend that, hey, you know what? Let's just keep brute force in place, and we'll build a screen scraper. Scratch that. We'll build an AI agent that can parse any web page, any web app. It's like we're missing the point. Give me an API so that the agent can be more efficient, and those that choose not to use an AI agent can also be more efficient. So that's where I hope the incentives actually end up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of a world where more APIs are delivered by people everywhere, by products everywhere, because of the AI hype, and then we all benefit. To your point, APIs are deterministic, right? And so obviously, in your example of the purchase order, that was dealing with a non-deterministic system, but like the end output is hopefully that you get that purchase order, right? You get the number, you get the amount. Where do you think there's and that obviously begs the question of like, when do you reach for a non-deterministic system versus a deterministic system? We're in the auth space. We think that portions of authentication should 100% be deterministic because it's security. But what's the litmus test an engineer should use to decide, hey, this is a deterministic API focused task versus actually an agent or a non-deterministic system?
So the rigid people listening are probably like, Kelsey, nothing is deterministic, right? Like, you're right. The concept of time in computing says nothing can be deterministic. The concept of a network, then the behavior can be unpredictable. You have no idea if the network's going to be down this time. You have no idea if that something may get lost in transit. This is why we add checksums to things to make sure that we're receiving the right thing. And also, you have no idea if you're under attack, right? So the checksum that you're verifying could be the hacked version of the thing you're about to parse. So in many ways, look, that stuff is still hard, but at least it was somewhat predictable, right? If I wrote a machine or some code that said, if this, then that, and if it didn't do that, just give me an error. Don't do anything else. In this new world, now that we have these Swiss Army knives of, I'm going to just call it like a framework. So you can call it an LLM, you can call it an agent, you can call it whatever you want, but you have this new Swiss Army knife of a framework. And it is not necessarily limited to the things and instructions that you give it. You're almost giving it agency. So I guess in some ways, calling them agents may be the appropriate term, but in that agency, you're making a trade-off. This thing says, hey, I'm going to go and try to parse this invoice. But if that doesn't work, I might just go to the internet and try to find another tool that could parse it. And in the meanwhile, I might upload your data to some random website that I found as a tool, pass that data along. You had no idea it was going to do that. And so the first time that this happens, now you have a data leak on your hands. So yes, could a human do that? Absolutely. But I think a human tends to have a consequence, right? They have a model of the world, which is maybe I shouldn't post this invoice into this random website. Like, most people probably have been tuned for that behavior over time. The model is going to try to do exactly what you've asked, which is parse this invoice, usually by any means necessary. And I think that's the new thing in software that we're not used to having the software exhibit these kind of side effects. I mean, the last time we had software that did this, we called it malware, right? Any software that was just on your machine, busy doing random things, you're like, oh, shut that down, right? Your virus scanner would detect that and say, yeah, this thing is doing abnormal behavior. Let's lock it down.
I love the idea of the last time we had non-deterministic like software that acted, we called it malware. That just kind of tells you some of the excitement, but some of the dangers of agents, right? I guess I kind of want to wrap up this discussion and kind of get to the questions. So the first question I have for you is Google Drive's permission model doesn't seem to be designed with agents in mind, right? You can't easily say, write to this folder, but you can't delete only for 24 hours. You can't kind of scope things down to that extent. Service accounts get you part way there, but it's not kind of totally standardized. And Google, as well as I do, has been pushing the boundary of security forward for a long time. And if they can't get this kind of permissioning right, what happens? Are other developers able to do so? And then that was more of a statement. The question is, what patterns or primitives should platform and API builders, who are hopefully on this call, be implementing today? And what would a agentic authorization layer that dealt with these issues look like?
And I think people are asking for something they don't actually want, but may be necessary. So I have empathy there. So let's talk about this auth in, auth z, right? So auth in is like who you are. Like I think we've kind of dialed that in. It could be a jot token, it could be username and password, it could be biometrics, or it could be a combination of those things. And then we're going to say, if you have these things, then you're Kelsey. Or we're going to assume you're Kelsey, or you have Kelsey tied up in the basement and you've managed to get him to log in for you so you can act on his behalf. So those are the things on the who are you side. The auth z side is tricky because I think most people were happy with the basics of like RBAC, right? Role-based access control. Like, hey, Kelsey is the admin, so he can do anything he wants on this platform. And the reason why we have admin, there's going to come a time where you don't know what permissions Kelsey needs if you expect him to be able to recover the system if it were to crash or to do something to get the company unstuck. So we have the admin role. And I know a lot of people fantasize about getting rid of admin. Don't be delusional. There's going to come a time where you're going to need a permission that you don't even understand that you need. And once you're done fighting errors, you're going to do what we always do. So you know what? We're getting too many errors. Let's make him admin, right? And hopefully you don't leave them admin forever, but that's why we still have things like admin. So that's the extreme. The other extreme is I think some people want this fine grain authorization. The problem with that is there's no limit to it. Read, write, update, the CRUD operations sound like there's enough there. But then you're going to have things like it can edit this paragraph, but not this paragraph. And then as a software developer, think about someone that had to implement auth z for just a Google Doc. If you told me that I could have fine-grained permissions at the paragraph level, like this header can't be touched by anyone except for the document owner, anyone in this group, but this paragraph can be edited by an agent, but not more than 140 characters. Think about the logic there. And so you're going to need a rules engine, right? You have to have a rules engine that a developer can then say, you know what? Here's what a paragraph is. Here's what the second paragraph is. And then here's how you deal with character counts. And so once you put all that logic in Google Docs, now you're going to have an explosion, probably the biggest performance issue you've ever seen. Because every time an edit happens, I have to say, who is editing this paragraph? Is this the second paragraph? Let me look at the time, because you just mentioned you can only have this access for 24 hours. I gave you this access. Oh, 1 second just went by. You're out of scope. So I'm not going to apply that edit error credential timeout editing paragraph 2. This is almost an intractable problem. You can try, but I just don't think customer demand will ever allow you to just build a solution that fits every customer's needs. So what's the next thing we're going to get? we're going to get things like authorization frameworks where people can make these own policy engines. Open Policy Agent comes to mind, where you can start to describe all of these activities. So a tool like Google Docs would then say, hey, there's an agent trying to edit this paragraph. Almost reminds me of like a Vim plugin, right? It's like, hey, here's what's being trying to be manipulated in this buffer. You're a plugin. Do you want to do anything here? Yeah, format that code. I think we're probably going to end up with those policy engine frameworks before we get all of these tools that have a trillion permission combinations, right? So I think you're going to end up with this thing where your enterprise is going to get a chance to authorize an action before you get Google Docs to give you the permissions that you're dreaming of.
So, I mean, at that point, you're just basically moving the problem upstream, right? And I totally get the spectrum from like super fine-grained built into an app versus admin. And I love your characterization of an admin is role is for permissions you don't even know you need when you're granted it, right? But with these Auth frameworks, and OpenFGA is one, Permify is one, Auth is one, there's a number of them out there. You just push the problem upstream. So you're saying, hey, developers of Google Docs, use this authorization engine. And I guess
let's be clear.
Oh yeah,
they have one, right? So I guess the white paper we're looking for here is Zanzibar, right? So the Zanzibar white paper, if you go read that white paper, it'll tell you like what happens when you get beyond basic CRUD operations and you have millions and millions of users. You almost need a permission graph at this point. You're going to have to take all the permission sets and then try to put it in like a database. So there's open source like SpiceDB, where you're going to try to calculate this graph so that everything we just talked about earlier becomes a lookup, right? Say, hey, this thing's trying to perform these actions. Can they do it or not? And ideally, something that implements something like Zanzibar would say, yes, that principal, which you've classified as an agent, can totally edit that paragraph at this particular time. So now you have to maintain all these permissions. But on the flip side of that architecture, so we have an architecture. Will it scale? I mean, I think for the average enterprise, possibly. But for the user, what does the settings box look like? So let's get to a real world application. So you're the user now. You've asked Google for this feature. Their talented engineering team goes off and does it. Now you log into the permissions platform and there's a trillion rows now. Hey, what would you like this agent to be able to do? Can it edit anything that starts with a capital T? What about things in English versus Spanish? It's like, how far do you want to go with this?
Well, most people will just click the edit all, right? Like that's what we've seen with OpenClaw stuff. So that's not a great answer. What is your answer? Like how do we solve this problem without giving them a billion checkboxes or one that says that everyone 99% people click that says edit all?
I think what you're going to end up with is the things that are actually important. If it's super important, what you're going to do, and I think we do this with software, we go backwards. Let's see what the agent does to get the desired result. Let's record everything that it's seeming to do. Do we like that? Then you kind of go backwards and say, well, what did the agent do? Well, the agent did this. It did this at this time frame. And then sometimes what we do in a sandbox, we say, you know what? That is the right thing to do. And then I'm going to say, system, can you generate a permission set that allows it to do only the things we just recorded it doing? And I think this is how these type of systems are going to implement something as complex as what you read in the Zanzibar paper could ever work. It's just going to record it, turn off all the permissions, just go into observe mode. And then you would say, all right, now that this thing has completed the task, what permissions are required to complete this task? And that's where when you start to fall short, where it says admin, you say, whoa, admin should not be required to do this. That's way too big. And then you will work with the vendor or the software developer. And you would say, we need something more fine-grained than admin. And then they can then go look and say, oh, this is what it was trying to do. There should be a subset of permissions that allow it to do that. We saw that evolution with GitHub. GitHub has way more fine-grained permissions than it used to have. And I think that might be the path forward. So observe in a sandbox, figure out what the right set of permissions are. That way you can tune the agent or you can tune the app, and then you make those happen. But I think that's what's going to be required.
And just to put a fine point on this, is this the again, in the Google Docs example, is this Google's responsibility to do this kind of heuristics, or is it the user's responsibility? Is it my responsibility as a user of Google Docs to go into observation mode to generate that permissions list, or who owns that activity?
So we can already see from history how this is going to play out. And we see this with some of the startups that I see, right? We mentioned I'm actually an investor as well. And some of the due diligence that we do, a lot of the AI security tools that you see out there, or some of the ones that are doing authorization, they're allowing the customer to do this at multiple levels. So of course, it would be great in this example that you gave, if the Google team were to do this to docs in a way that makes everyone satisfied. But most people probably won't be happy with that because you have another problem, which is the ability to log in there and just change it. Then the other factor that we see is like the man in the middle, right? Whether that's a proxy or some kind of gateway that is minting credentials on behalf of the agent in real time. So the agent goes off to do something, and then what you end up doing is you just give it a scope set of credentials. You say, you know what? Our company's only comfortable with these 8 permissions. And if that doesn't work for your agent, then we need to have a discussion. And so what you're seeing now is, where there's a system like Vault or any other thing that can do dynamic credentials, that thing will issue out credentials in a way that limits the scope. So I think the whole concept of IAM and federated identity and permissioning systems allows you to have this at multiple layers, right? So maybe we can trust people to configure the endpoint system right based on history. That doesn't always go well. And also sometimes the vendor makes a mistake where the permissions don't actually get upheld, and now you have other kind of problems. So I think what we're seeing right now today in real life are people leveraging things like networking tools and credential tools that issue credentials that then have scopes applied to them. And let's just be honest, that right now still isn't enough because there's just not enough upstream fine-grained permissions to make these even work.
Yep. A lot of work to be done there. And I 100% agree that it's going to take some time, but I think it needs to happen. You kind of mentioned MCP earlier, and so we had a question come in about that. MCP is converging on OAuth for remote server authentication and authorization, but there's still a lot of hand waving about how consent scopes and token scoping work across a client, an MCP server, and the downstream API or data source that the MCP server wraps. What does in your opinion, what does a mature MCP auth story look like in 2 to 3 years? And where do you see the biggest gaps right now?
It looks exactly like the web. It looks exactly like what we already have. I think people really do think we're going to invent something new. You're not, mainly because it needs adoption. The thing that works for the downstream system, right? Like if I call an API, if you're advanced, you're going to exchange that token on the edge anyway. A client shows up, you're going to exchange that token for a very scoped token based on the API that was called. And then downstream, you don't know where that's going to go, but you know it's going to go somewhere with the scope token without the ability to impersonate the original caller. So we've done this before, right? The challenge is we have no idea what the agent wants to do. But people want these agents to work, and they want them to work right now. So a lot of people are just like, let it do whatever it needs to do, give it all the access that it needs. Until we tighten that up, that's a discipline problem. Until we exercise discipline, like I have never seen people wanting so bad to unleash software to production that they have no idea what it does and expect that we can figure out how to limit its scope. Like you're just going to have to know ahead of time and mint those permissions. I think another thing that is probably important for people to think about with MCP servers is a lot of the APIs that exist today are not intent-based. And I had this debate with people in the MCP community. I'm like, I don't see how MCP is very innovative. From my studying of what this thing is trying to do, it's a plugin system that wraps other APIs and tools. And its goal is to create an API that has intention. And so what do I mean by intention? One way to think about this would be, if you were trying to create a virtual machine in the cloud, you're going to have to call like 7 API endpoints. You got to create a network, a disk, attach it to a machine, pick an operating system, maybe an IP address, and bind them all. But your intent was to create a VM. Your intent wasn't to call 7 APIs. I hope you did it right, because then the permission scheme for that is way too big. You want the ability to create an IP address for the intention of attaching it to a VM. So when you look at MCP, its job is to say, wait a minute, let's wrap all 7 of those things into a new endpoint called create VM. So when an agent shows up to create a virtual machine, ideally, you're giving it the permission to call that particular MCP for the sole purpose of creating a VM. and not giving it the ability to create random networks and random IP addresses. We've seen this with Terraform and classic configuration management, right? A lot of people create Terraform modules to wrap cloud behavior into something that's approved by the company. And then you give permission to people to use those particular modules. So I think we're just seeing the same thing with MCP. And so that's the way I like to think about this. We probably also need better intent-based APIs, so we're not granting so many permissions to do basic things.
Yeah, and it's not just the permissions, but it's like you said, it's not any random IP address you can create or any random network. It's like only in the scope of the task that the agent is trying to do. How do you even start to think about that? Is it like use case driven? Is that what would you start with? Or do you go look at your Terraform modules if you're an infra provider and say, oh, our customers have asked for these kind of intents or these kind of actions, so we're going to wrap it all in an MCP server at the level of this Terraform module? How would you approach that?
The good news, the people have already seen this. So about 14 years ago, 12 years ago, depending on how you count, 12 years ago, this thing called Kubernetes came out. And if you look at its design, a lot of Kubernetes just wraps things into intentions, right? This desired state thing. So for example, let's take the ingress controller as a great example. When you create an ingress in Kubernetes, which gives you a load balancer pointed at your app, all you do is create one object. I want an ingress pointed to this service. Under the hood, that ingress controller, depending on if you're Azure or an AWS or GCP or your own integration that you've chosen to build for yourself, it will then call the same 7 or 8 APIs required to create a load balancer and map it to your containers running in your cluster. So we've already seen this. So that is an intent-based API. So if you're a cloud provider or a vendor, these are common things that you want people to do. So you can imagine a world where you say, hey, look, we're going to keep those same fine-grained APIs for people who want to compose infrastructure. But we've looked at it over time, and most people are just calling these APIs just to get a load balancer. So we're going to introduce a load balancer API. And that load balancer API is going to be an aggregate of the most important components of the other API. So you just say, give me a load balancer. And I don't care what IP address, just get one. And then once you get it, put it in DNS to this name. That's it. Now you have an intent-based API. Why don't cloud providers or vendors do this? Mainly because it's too opinionated. And I think this is the part where if you ever had to maintain APIs for a long period of time, it's so hard to deprecate an API that lots of people use. So whenever you build these intent APIs, you're kind of stuck with them. So this is why I think people tend to build these composable fine-grained APIs, because they can be composed to anything. But I think the agent world is telling us we're going to have to do both. You're going to have the rigid, low-level, assembly of your API, and then you're going to have the high-level functions and libraries that people just make jobs easier for people.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in the early days of MCP, which was probably about 14, 15 months ago, everyone was doing MCPs that mapped directly to their API endpoints, and people were finding that to be pretty useless. So we had a question from Daniel. Thank you for bringing the question. And I don't know if we can see that whole thing, but basically the question was, if I understood correctly, an Auth protocol should be created or at least leveraged for agentic AI. How do you see the governance of that kind of protocol happening?
So here's where I think you're not good. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think you're going to create a new protocol, because the problem is these systems are designed to integrate with existing systems. That's the key thing, I think, in our understanding. They're going to have to authorize and authenticate to existing systems. So unless you can get every other company in the world to agree on new Auth protocols, this is going to be very hard. But where does the Auth protocol meet the agent? That's the key understanding here. So the agent should not be responsible for giving itself permissions. Like, we would all probably agree on that. Just like we don't let people give themselves their own permissions, because that kind of defeat the point. So we already have a mechanism. Whether it's good or not, that's debatable. But we have a way to give an agent credentials. It could be a JOT token. It can be an SSL certificate. Doesn't matter. We have a way to give an agent something to identify itself. So that's the auth-in piece. Now that it has those credentials in hand, how do we scope what the agent can do? Remember, if you write a shell script, typically you're going to write a shell script to do one thing. This shell script creates a virtual machine. We actually kind of have this problem for Terraform. If you think about Terraform as an infrastructure agent, right? I know it doesn't have the fancy word, but Terraform actually has the exact same problem. So Terraform, for those that don't know, is a tool. It's like a framework for being able to interact with the cloud provider. And so to make your job easy, Terraform ships with things like the GCP provider. And what does that thing do? That thing allows you to create BigQuery instances, database instances, VMs, virtual machines, you name it. But in order to do that, guess what you got to give Terraform? You have to give it a credential that is so big that it can do anything that you may ask Terraform to do. So you can't, I mean, I guess you could give it like 50 credentials and put them all in a safe place. And then based on what module you're going to run, you can give it a credential for that task. So in the Terraform world, you could have 50 scope credentials. And I'll give you an example. This one credential, all it can do is create S3 buckets. This credential, all it can do is create VMs. This credential, all it could do is allow VMs to talk to S3 buckets. You see how this gets out of control? But you could do that. And then you could map each of those credentials to that particular Terraform run. So you can imagine calling Terraform apply, but use this credential. And if that doesn't work, you might say, well, use these 3 credentials. If that gets too cumbersome, here's what you're probably going to do. You're going to make a third credential that wraps all 3. And now that third credential allows that entire Terraform module to actually work. So maybe you could do 1 credential per module. Now let's get to the agentic. This is why I think fundamentals are so important. You've already been dealing with this problem for 10 years. The thing about Terraform, it was somewhat predictable. You could look at the module and see what credentials you would need. And you could just mint those ahead of time. And typically, the cloud provider was almost a one-to-one match to the IAM that was supported by the other endpoint that you're trying to configure. Agentic AI changes all of this. I can't tell by looking at your prompt what permissions the agent's going to need. This is the big challenge. So this is not a new Auth protocol. You just created a problem. So now I say, hey, I would like you to clean up my inbox. We have no idea what that means. That could mean organize everything by folders, or it could be delete everything. We don't know. And so once it tries to do something, depending on its permission set, you might say, you know what? This thing is going to interact with email. I'm only comfortable with it creating folders and moving email into those folders. That's all I'm comfortable with. So if you think about that as an Auth protocol, like the way we behave, it may change our mindset to say, you know what? This agent can do a lot of stuff. Here's what I'm comfortable with it doing. And then you use that to mint your credentials. And then you give it to the agent. And anything beyond those, so any surprises, either you're like, wow, I didn't know I was giving you those permissions. Let me scope this thing down even further. So I don't think we need a new protocol, but I do think we need a better way to express what we would like the agent to be able to do and not do. And maybe that substitutes all those checkboxes that you see in those permission tools.
Right. And this gets back to the heuristic, right? Like, but there's going to be some human responsibility for determining kind of the scope, which also, again, gets back to the intent-based APIs that you mentioned. Another question we had from a Rootly AI software developer said, we've spent decades building deterministic systems, as you kind of mentioned, with Terraform and whatnot. AI gives us powerful new capabilities, but introduces non-determinism. Practitioners keep pointing to the need for an intermediary layer. This is that gateway, or some of those other things you talked about, that enforces some kind of contract between the two worlds of deterministic and non-deterministic behavior. Please just grant that determinism exists to some extent with software. And then what does that intermediate layer that sits between determinism and non-determinism actually look like in practice?
So, you know, one thing that I admire about the early computer scientists, they would go out in nature to answer questions like these. And this is how we got in some consensus algorithms, the classic 2 general problem. These are real world constructs and contracts. These are things that have been studied for a very long time. I think people are thinking that AI requires a whole new set of thinking. Remember, AI is designed to mimic what we already do. It's been trained on the past. And so when we think about a question like this, a human is somewhat non-deterministic. I have no idea what you're going to do. I don't know if you had a bad day. So we have frameworks in place. We have things like speed limits and traffic lights. You can ignore them, but we at least put them in place to say, hey, this is about how fast you should go. Now, what happens when you do something you're not supposed to? Well, in society, we have things like cameras that will record your license plate if you run the red light, and then you will get a ticket. If it's really dangerous, we'll put a speed bump so that your car gets damaged instead of you hitting a kid trying to go to school. So we put in these safeguards. This is real world things that we already know how to do. If it's a car lot, they'll have those spikes in the ground that you can't drive out right now, right? Because no one should be driving cars right now because we're closed. These safeguards will always be required, especially when you have a system that is designed to do things that you may not expect it to be able to do. That's kind of where the power comes from, because if it didn't do those, then we should just all be using bash scripts. So it does have value, and part of the value is the fact that it is flexible, that it is non-deterministic, and it may find new routes to solve a problem, right? This is the nice thing with Google Maps versus a static map. Google Maps will reroute you if there's a problem, whereas the static map is like, good, you got to draw your own new routes. So I really do think we need to figure out a way to say these safeguards will be required even more so now. So before, you were able to get away without them. If you want to unleash an AI agent into production, you guaranteed will need speed bumps and traffic lights and a cop on the beat to issue those speeding citations when these things start to get out of hand.
I love that analogy. It feels like there's a lot of work to be done to build all those speed bumps and traffic lights and speed cameras. Another question we had kind of approaches this from a different angle. This again from the Rootly AI folks. The homegrown trap for human auth is well understood. Teams underestimate token rotation, session validation, and edge cases until they're breached, and then they discover that these are important things to think about. For agent-to-agent communication, we're starting to see teams reinvent this from scratch. Custom agent identity schemes, bespoke delegation chains, homegrown tool permission models. What are one or two mistakes you're already seeing engineering teams make when they roll their own agent authorization? And is there an equivalent of just use OIDC or just use RBAC emerging for agent identity and authorization? Or is the standards layer still kind of too immature right now?
I think the standard layers are fine. What you talked about has always been the case, even for microservices. There is no standard for very fine-grained authorization. There's frameworks, like SpiceDB, but there's no way to do it perfectly. So if you have a microservice that needs to have fine-grained permissions, that's on you, the developer. You're going to have some code that says, if this principal tries to do this thing, you go look in your permission database and you figure out whether it can do it. We've been rolling that part forever. That's a thing, because no one's going to ever agree on what all of these things are. But we are starting to get frameworks. Again, we talked about the Zanzibar approach and all of these things. That's going to always be there. The other thing I think people have to realize is, specifically when it comes to AI agents, there is no reason why you have to run an agent doing inference in production every single time. The thing that I like that I see some people do, they'll use an agent to figure out what steps need to be run. So an agent goes out and it figures out the best path to complete a task. And maybe you're like, wow, I never thought to call those 5 tools in that order, and it totally works. What you can then do is, quote unquote, cache the result. It's almost like SSHing into a server and running a bunch of commands until it works. Then you look back into your command history and you turn the right set of commands into a bash script. And then you can just run that bash script in cache mode. Nothing's stopping you from doing remember, the agent is still calling the same tools that you were calling before. So one solution to this might be use an agent to get you the perfect set of steps that work. Take the output of that and just put it in a classic program. That way it's not doing inference anymore. It's going to be way more predictable. So that's just how you do it. We did this with databases, right? If you run a SQL query, you have no idea if that SQL query is going to cause a full table scan, if it's going to run into some weird conflict. And if your only goal is to get a particular result, then we've cached those things. So not only will you save a bunch of money by caching these things and not doing inference for something you already know how to do, there's just a lot of side effects, I think, from a security perspective, that once I compile down this particular agent or set of routines, then I can almost treat it a little closer to normal software and put a bigger sandbox around it.
What does cache invalidation look like in that scenario? I love that idea of software as an artifact that gets cached, but what does cache invalidation look like?
I love that question, because why did you create the agent in the first place? If you created the agent to be able to parse, these 5 particular PDFs, then that cache, that script will work. Cache invalidation looks like, hey, number 6 has showed up and the script doesn't work. Hey, okay. Now we need to invalidate the cache. We now need to update that particular script or task. And we may use the agent again to run through the thing and say, hey, let's pick up where we left off. We also want to support anything that looks like this as potential input. And then you kind of tune that until it works. And then you say, cache it again. Guess what? We have this thing called versioning. You can literally version software. So if that was version 1, you can ship version 2. That's how we did cache invalidation for software for a very long time.
Great. So final question, Josh Richards asks, do you think AI agents are here to stay? And what impact do you think it's going to have on the open source community? So I guess final 2 questions, and then we're going to wrap things up.
So to me, I think it would be very helpful if we stop saying AI agents. It's cool now because we're all confused. Burning tokens is in fashion. But at some point, thinking will come back. And when thinking comes back, we're just going to say, do you think automation is here to stay? The answer is yes. That's kind of the point of having a computer. A computer allows you to automate things. These new agent frameworks, these new large language models, domain-specific models, they allow us to automate even more things, especially unstructured inputs and things that don't have a clean API, right? So those agents help us do those kind of things. I love it. I think it's amazing. I remember discovering screen scraping libraries that allowed me to go deal with random web pages that I've never encountered before, and I was able to extract data for them. So that component was amazing. So I think automation is here to stay. Whether we use AI agents for everything is a different question. I think from a pure computer science, software engineering mindset, we always optimize. So today, agents allow us to brute force a lot of things. What you're going to see are frameworks that just have it built into a more symbolic type style of programming, and it will be able to handle way more Swiss Army knife type things. So we're going to definitely cache. I guarantee you, in 10 years, there's going to be a whole conference about reducing token burn by going back to logical things like using classical programming with the help of an AI tool to produce workflows. What impact do you think is going to have on open source community? This is another area we're going to ask ourselves, what is an open source community? A lot of people have confused open source to be a bunch of software that you get for free. Some people believe that they think that's not the case, but they treat it that way. And this is why they think AI is the end all be all to open source. And this is a very genuine question. The way I've always thought about open source is a group of people who come together that want to solve a particular problem. And so if you're Guido van Rossum, you created Python because you just thought maybe Perl or the tools that came before it, maybe you just didn't like the syntax. And so you then curate a certain thing, and it's closer to fashion to me. And I've been a maintainer of open source project where I had to say no to some features. Why? Because I was trying to have that library or tool work a certain way. I didn't want all the features in the world. We don't need everything to evolve. There's nothing wrong with LS being done. There's nothing wrong with CP being a dedicated tool. So I think when it comes to open source community, I think it's still going to rely on stewardship, people working together on a common problem, choosing to share their solution. And if that doesn't work for you, I think it's okay to create another project, even if it rhymes with the other one.
Great. Wow. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for submitting their questions. Sorry if we didn't get to everyone's. I want to bring Ben back on to close things out.
Had to find my mute button there. Thank you, everyone that joined the webinar. As just a special quick gift, we recommend you download our Agentic white paper. super relevant regarding NHI and a lot of the discussion today, or visit fusionauth.io to browse the resources there. Thanks again to Kelsey, Dan, and everyone that submitted questions previously and on the webinar. Have a great rest of your day.